Boa tarde a todos. Em nome do excelentíssimo diretor do Instituto da Defesa Nacional, professor Dr. João Marques de Almeida, está aberta esta sessão. O diretor do Instituto da Defesa Nacional, professor Dr. João Marques de Almeida, vai usar da palavra.
Boa tarde a todos e bem-vindos. Eu irei agradecer a presença da senhora Subsecretária da Defesa para Assuntos Africanos. Irei dar as boas-vindas em inglês e depois passarei a palavra à doutora Isabel Nunes para apresentar e ler o currículo da doutora Teresa Whelan. Welcome to the Institute. We very much look forward for your lecture. And the topic, as you know, it's of very much interest for us in Lisbon and in Portugal. Dr. Teresa Whelan will talk about U.S. policy in Africa, and as we know, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, the United States are much more interested in African affairs, in security in Africa, than before. I'm sure the 9/11 and all the subsequent developments have a lot to do with that. But not only to Washington, but to most of the European states, and even for other great powers, Africa is becoming a much more important part of the world, both for security but also for energy reasons. And we know from public declarations of the members of the American administration that the United States, the American government, is going through a process of redefinition of its policy towards Africa. And so in that respect, we are very much interested in listening to you and to what you have to tell us about that.
Thank you. Boa tarde, Sr. Diretor, Madam Secretary, excelentíssimos senhores e senhoras, boa tarde. E eu passaria de imediato a apresentar a conferencista desta tarde, a Sra. Subsecretária Adjunta de Defesa para os Assuntos Africanos, sendo o seu gabinete responsável pelo Departamento de Política de Defesa para toda a região subsaariana. Da sua vasta experiência profissional, eu iria apenas referir algumas das funções desempenhadas recentemente, nomeadamente aquelas que ocupou entre 1998 e 2000, como chefe da NATO Team Task Force para a crise do Kosovo e, posteriormente, como Task Force Deputy Chief of Staff. Mais recentemente, desempenhou também a função de diretora do Office of African Affairs. É detentora de 2 mestrados, um na área dos estudos de segurança nacional pela Universidade de Georgetown e outro em estratégia de segurança nacional pelo NATO War College. Tem uma longa experiência de 12 anos em assuntos africanos, que estamos certos que os presentes neste auditório terão muito interesse e gosto em poder testemunhar. Madam Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you especially to Dr. De Almeida and the Institute for inviting me today. This is, I think, a wonderful opportunity to share our thinking, but hopefully I will speak quickly enough and be brief enough to allow for some exchange of questions and answers and comments on your part, because I would be very interested in hearing your thinking as well. Because I am from the U.S. Department of Defense, I not only come with a speaking text and speaking notes, but we are known, of course, for those of you who have worked with U.S. Department of Defense, for our PowerPoint presentations. So we are not allowed to speak without the prop of slides. So hopefully that will be useful here today. I think this is a fascinating, albeit in some ways a dangerous time in the world, as I think great shifts are underway politically, economically, and militarily. I think it's the Chinese who have a famous curse. They say, "May you live in interesting times." And I think these are very interesting times in the world today. One of the reasons they are interesting is that I think the paradigms that we have used in some cases for more than a century to understand relationships between nation states and the requirements for security are being fundamentally challenged and even probably in some cases shattered. Now, the world has always been an unpredictable place from a security standpoint, but I don't think we've had quite this much unpredictability in the world and flux in the world since the time between World War I and World War II. And what I want to talk about today is how that flux and unpredictability is shifting our understanding in the United States of security and the threats to it. I've been involved in one way or another in African affairs since 1987. And outside of the various times of crises, for example, Somalia in 1992 or Rwanda in 94 or Liberia sort of numerous times throughout the past decade, I really can't recall a time in which Africa had more prominence on the general U.S. strategic agenda than it does today. That doesn't mean that Africa has moved to the absolute center of the U.S. agenda. Obviously, we have a few other things at the center of our agenda, but it is certainly no longer on the periphery. In fact, I think the attention that the U.S., the EU, the G8, and now even NATO are paying to Africa is quite unprecedented, and I think it is continuing to grow. Question is why? Well, in our view, it's really necessitated by a post-9/11 security environment that requires that we pay close attention to what we are calling ungoverned space, which is both physical and non-physical. And it's this concept that's at the center of a strategic paradigm shift, and that's what I'd like to talk about. So first, what I'd focus on and will focus on is the security environment in Africa today. Then we'll move on and elaborate on this concept of ungoverned space, and I'll provide you with some specific examples in Africa that we think pose a challenge. And then from there, I'll also discuss some ways in which we're seeking to reduce ungoverned space in exploitable areas, and from a security perspective, the tools that are applicable to achieving that end. Our understanding of and corresponding response to our security environments, I think, has gone through some fundamental changes over the years. In the 1950s, our great concern was determining how to fight in the time, place, and manner of our choosing in the atomic age. In the 1980s, we focused on competitive technological strategies against the Soviet Union and the rollback of communist expansion in the developing world, Africa in particular. The key dimensions of the 21st century, globalization and the potential proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, mean that dangers may arise and emanate from states that do not exercise effective sovereignty. And this poses very different challenges than those from previous decades. And consequently, it's bringing Africa into greater prominence. Sub-Saharan Africa continues to face constant security, political, and economic crises. Government corruption is a major problem. Many countries, of course, have limited or unreliable capacities for internal security, law enforcement, and also border protection. This Africa environment is unfortunately not new, as many of you know much better than I. But what is new, from our perspective at least, is its relevance to this concept of ungoverned space. when looking at how to address the African security environment and the challenges that it poses, there are three key ideas that underlie U.S. thinking these days. The first is that we cannot predict events with any degree of precision. We certainly did not predict that on September 10th, 2001, that Afghanistan was going to be a major theater of military operations for us within a matter of months. If you had said that to any general in the Pentagon or any official in the U.S. government on September 10th, they would have looked at you as if you needed to be committed to an asylum. So unpredictability is a key. We also, we believe, need to recognize the value of taking early measures to resolve problems before they become crises. And the third thing is that we need to improve our capacity to work together to address common security problems. And that's actually one of the reasons that I'm here in Portugal, because we are here to talk about ways we can work bilaterally, multilaterally with Portuguese as well as other European allies in addressing problems in Africa. All right, so what's this concept of ungoverned space that I keep talking about? The way we're defining ungoverned space is that it is a physical or non-physical area where there is an absence of state capacity or political will to exercise control. Physical space obviously can be land area. In the Africa context, you could talk about the Sahel region, where we have terrorist groups like the GSPC that operates out of Algeria, or say, for example, also the Niger Delta in Nigeria, where you have corruption and criminal activity that are pervasive, and where the government is having great difficulty exercising any control. Or there is also something that we oftentimes forget, and those are the maritime areas, the African coastal waters, such as the Gulf of Guinea, or the Swahili coast, or the Southwest Indian Ocean, Mozambique and Channel area. Non-physical space might, for example, involve financial space, where there's little capacity or legal authority to prevent terrorists from raising and moving monies in support of future terrorist attacks. Both this physical and non-physical space is the space that terrorists thrive in and actually really need in order to exist. Now, this concept, or the existence of ungoverned space, isn't new, just like the threat environment in Africa isn't new. But what is new is the fact that we are now looking at this as a 21st century threat. And this is the fundamental paradigm shift in terms of our strategic thinking about threats. In the past, we were actually concerned really about governed space, because governed space was where massive military power could be built and sustained. And that, in our view, was really the only type of power that we believed could pose a serious threat to us. Totalitarian regimes actually represented the ultimate in governed space, as they basically controlled everything. We didn't focus on countries that couldn't control anything outside their capitals. Those countries weren't threats to us. They oftentimes drew upon our resources for humanitarian reasons, or because we were involved in development projects and the like, or because we had to evacuate our citizens because their governments collapsed. But they were certainly not threats to us. So 9/11, though, I think has brought home to us the fact that we really can't think like that any longer. And so we now have the traditional threats still, and we have the threat of ungoverned space. And I think that's the reason why Africa is actually showing up more on the radar screens in Washington. For those who have worked on Africa for a long time, I think you know that the solutions to Africa's problems are really going to be of a very different nature and much more complex than the solutions that we had to traditional security problems and threats. One of the key tools to addressing this new threat is effective security cooperation, and in that can help to reduce ungoverned areas and deny those areas to terrorist organizations. Looking at the descriptions on this slide a bit more closely, I think you'll see that I've already talked a bit about ungoverned territories. There are plenty of rugged, remote, maritime, and littoral areas that require more effective government control in Africa, and this is probably what first comes to mind when you think about ungoverned space. But there are other equally important components of this ungoverned space concept. For example, competing governance. This exists when a state is unable or unwilling to exercise authority in certain areas and so cedes that authority to outside elements. For example, this might include countries that lack adequate resources to implement widespread education programs and increasingly rely by default on externally supported madrasas, for example, to educate their children. This is happening in places as distinct as Ethiopia, Mali, northern Mozambique, and elsewhere in Africa. Exploitation of legal principles is sort of a self-explanatory component of the definition of ungoverned space, but it includes the legal rights and principles that can be exploited by individuals to radicalize and motivate disaffected populaces. In Africa, I think the problem tends to be a lack of legal principles or selective enforcement of those that exist. Corruption is also a factor here. And then lastly, an opaque area of activity would involve the state's inability to monitor or control illicit transactions, such as moving monies supportive of terrorist planning. In Africa, I think this often tends to be a capacity problem. So even if you have the laws in place to protect against such things, you may not really have the resources to enforce them. Also, as we noted in talking about competing governance, incapacity and the lack of political will may actually interact. The decision of some governments to relinquish control over certain core governance functions may be partially the result of low capacity, which forces budget trade-offs. Finally, of course, in Africa, it's really not unusual, unfortunately, to have the complete collapse of the central government, which can contribute to the creation of ungoverned territories where, over the long run, competing forms of governance emerge. This next slide takes a look at the security problems or the military challenges that we generally face when looking at security problems. And there are 4 different types. Obviously, the traditional challenges involving armies, navies, and air forces. Then the disruptive challenge, which would be from competitors who employ new technologies to counter our current military advantages. Catastrophic challenges through the acquisition, possession, and use of weapons of mass destruction. And finally, of course, the irregular challenges, which refer to non-state and state actors employing unconventional methods to counter stronger state opponents. Many of these challenges exist in Africa in one way or another due to the continent's considerable ungoverned space. The catastrophic and irregular challenges are the ones that we think apply most to the ungoverned space problem. And it really shouldn't come as any surprise, therefore, that Africa is a potentially attractive place for violent extremists and terrorists and even criminals to operate. All right, so talked about the problem of ungoverned space. How do we address the problem? Well, the answer is simple. You establish governance. The problem is that governance is not just a security sector problem. That's only one piece. Governance, really, the kind of governance that we need to establish in order to reduce ungoverned space, is the interaction of the security sector with other government sectors, such as the economic sector, the justice sector, basic services, and even, as I mentioned before, the education sector. All these sectors have to be strengthened almost simultaneously, and that's no easy task, particularly if you're facing corruption in a government. I like this slide not only because it has neat colors on it, but also because I think it makes clear in a graphic way that reducing ungoverned space is not strictly a military endeavor. A balance has to be struck between sustainable economic development, national security, justice and law, and political institutions and civil society. You can't expect to progress in one area and have the impact you desire if you're not progressing as well in other areas, and progress in other areas continues to lag. Similarly, you can't build a counterterrorism capacity with a military without keeping an eye on how that capability might otherwise be used. For example, is it going to be used to repress perceived political enemies of the state rather than deal with legitimate terrorist threats? So the next question is, when we're trying to do this in Africa, what's the African environment that we face? This slide portrays the challenges that we face when working across Africa. I think these factors add to the complexity of working across the various sectors of government in Africa. First, and most obviously, we have to address the cultural differences between Western countries and African countries in the way we do business, approach problems, share information, and also think about time and other things. There are also cultural differences between African nations themselves, and our approaches to building governance capacity have to take those cultural differences into account. In other words, a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work in Africa. You have to tailor your approach to each individual country. Corruption further complicates the problem because it undermines the desire of the countries you're working with to see effective change. Obviously, improved governance capacity would stifle opportunities for corruption, so consequently, corrupt officials are not really inclined to work with you in a meaningful way to implement reforms. Then, of course, lack of health care, HIV/AIDS, and high illiteracy all impact negatively on efforts to build capacity for governance because it really limits the pool of people that we have to work with to effect change. The last three challenges are systemic and structural problems that impact negatively on a country's ability to sustain whatever capacity improvements we are able to make. What I'd like to do in the next couple of slides is take the ungoverned space definition and its components and talk about some examples in the various regions of Africa, starting off first with West Africa. Looking at the example of ungoverned territories, obviously we know that there's ungoverned space between North Africa and the Sahel, the Sahara Desert area, where we have, as I mentioned before, terrorist groups like the GSPC or the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and others transiting, and where the governments in that area really don't have much capacity to control that movement. In the Niger Delta and northern Mali, there's little exercise of government authority. So you have competing governance, essentially, as local authorities are beginning to try and push the government out. And sometimes it's not even local authorities. It's those that have designated themselves local authorities. In terms of opaque areas of activity, we have the illicit diamond trade going on in West Africa, as well as, of course, the sale of illegal weapons and drugs. The drug trade is increasing in Africa, which is a problem not just in the context of counter-narcotics, but it is also a problem in the context of counterterrorism, because the resources, the money that flows from the drug trade can often finance terrorist operations. In East Africa, we have examples of ungoverned territories in the coastal waters along Sudan, Somalia. We have, obviously, right now we have a major problem with piracy along the Somalia coast. And, of course, there's no functioning government in Somalia, although the TFG is trying. We have governments exercising little or no control in the Ogaden area, in southwestern Ethiopia, in northern Uganda. And then, of course, I think we're all very familiar these days with the problems in Darfur, where the atrocities continue to occur. Looking at the legal principles example, in Kenya, the courts are weak. They are not successful in prosecuting criminals and terrorist suspects. And unfortunately, Kenya has actually been forced to release terrorist suspects that they had in custody due to the inadequacy of Kenyan law. In Central Africa, we have ungoverned territories in North Central African Republic, the Gulf of Guinea. In the Great Lakes region, the Democratic Republic of Congo does not exercise effective control along its border with Rwanda and Burundi and Uganda. We also have unregulated diamond and mineral exploitation going on, as well as weapons smuggling. You have militia groups and outside countries and interests involved in all of these things, and Congolese officials really have no control over these activities. Finally, looking at Southern Africa, you have ungoverned territories in the Southwest Indian Ocean. This is obviously maritime territories. Specifically the Mozambique Channel, which is considered by some to be the last great fishing ground in the world. A lack of monitoring, control, and surveillance capabilities among the nations bordering the channel has led to unacceptable levels of overfishing and general environmental degradation. This robs the nations there of economic resources, which should really be funneled back into their economies. They're actually being robbed of billions, not millions, but billions of dollars in potential resources from fisheries. That's according to the World Bank. It's the lack of these enforcement capabilities that creates an attractive venue for other criminal activities, to include smuggling and terrorist activities. You have the problem of illegal entry into South Africa, and border security is also a challenge, as legitimate documents can be acquired through corruption. South Africa's strong economy creates a great deal of movement into and out of South Africa, and a South African passport gives access to other Commonwealth countries, so consequently is highly coveted. South Africa has a well-developed high-technology base and is a world leader, actually, in a number of technologies. Although South Africa has renounced its WMD program, the expertise remains, and the AQ-CON proliferation network, operating out of Pakistan, is known to have actually taken advantage of some of South Africa's technology. So now I've defined the ungoverned space problem as, at least as we see it, discussed our theoretical approach to dealing with it and the practical challenges that we see in implementing the theory in Africa. And I've also given you some specific illustrative examples of the ungoverned space challenges that we face in different parts of the continent. So what does this therefore mean for the U.S. Department of Defense? Where do we, for example, fit in to addressing this problem? To begin to answer that question, I offer you the Secretary of Defense's priorities for Africa. And I would note that with the possible exception of the first bullet, the emphasis in these priorities is on prevention, and really prevention through security cooperation. This is our security strategy for Africa. And I think this slide essentially tries to boil the matter down to its essence. The three key pillars of addressing the security component of the ungoverned space problem in Africa. And again, let me emphasize that security is only one component of the problem. You have to also address the other sectors. But in the context of the security component, we believe that these are the three key areas that we need to work in. And I would note again, the emphasis here is on prevention, especially if you look at the last bullet. This slide takes those elements and defines them in more detail. Now, while working in these areas can obviously help build reliable partners who can help us respond to today's threats, in our view, the prevention and deterrence that can derive from a more competent and capable security capacity in Africa is actually an even more important outcome. This, in our view, is as much a part of fighting the war on terrorism and dealing with post-9/11 security threats as is the kinetic component of that war. Better, in our view, to win the battles essentially at this stage instead of waiting until a kinetic response is required. This slide shows some of our key DoD assistance programs in Africa today. IMET, of course, provides training to selected foreign military and defense-associated civilian personnel on a grant basis, and I think you all are familiar with that program. We train them at U.S. military facilities with our personnel, and we also, of course, use mobile training teams to send into the field. In FY 2006, we actually allocated just over $10 million in IMET funding to various African countries. However, some of the countries that have not signed the ASPA, the American Servicemen Protection Act waiver, did not receive any money. So we don't have complete coverage. FMF, obviously, is our program of grants and loans to countries to purchase U.S. defense articles, services, and training. In FY 2006, our FMF for Africa totaled just over $16 million. Again, those countries under sanction can't receive FMF. TSCTI, or the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Initiative, which I think has gotten a fair amount of publicity these days, seeks to protect the nations in the Saharan region, Sahel region, against terrorist groups and thwart the development of terrorist safe havens and training bases in both the Sahel and the Maghreb. This is European Command's #1 counterterrorism priority. There are 9 partner nations in this effort, and they include Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Mauritania, Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, and Nigeria. DHAP, or our DoD HIV/AIDS prevention program, provides care and treatment and prevention services to the militaries in Africa and also worldwide, although the bulk of our work is actually done in Africa. The FY 2006 budget for this program is just over $3 million. Then there's the ACOTA program, the Africa Contingency Operations Training and Assistance Program, which is a successor program to an earlier program known as the Africa Crisis Response Initiative, ACRI. We moved to the ACOTA format, ACOTA model, in 2002 after reviewing ACRI along with other programs that we had, such as Operation Focus Relief, and addressing lessons learned and adjusting our training and our program accordingly. We also took into account the various feedback that we had received from the African governments on this program. Its purpose is to enhance, develop, and sustain Africa peace support operations capability and capacity at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels. We have 14 countries in Africa signed up as partners so far, and there are 3 additional countries that we will likely sign up as partners in the next year. This is a State Department funded program executed in conjunction with the Defense Department. And then lastly, our newest initiative, it's still very green. The ink is still drying on the concept papers, but is the Africa Maritime Governance Initiative. And it's a program to assist African countries in better governing their maritime space. We hope that it will be able to help coordinate the execution of existing and new U.S. programs and initiatives in the areas of coastal and maritime security. And this includes the Gulf of Guinea and the Southwest Indian Ocean coastal areas. As I indicated at the beginning of this brief, in many ways, I think Africa is a much higher priority than it was 10 to 15 years ago. The bottom line for us from a security perspective on Africa is that an international system of willing and able partners that exercise effective sovereignty, bolsters our security. So our objective is for the footprint of governance to match the footprint of effective sovereignty. In the Africa context, we have ways to go before we achieve that objective. And if one of the biggest threats of the 21st century involves the nexus or potential nexus between terrorists who seek to harm us and the most dramatic and effective means by which they could do so, accessing and moving weapons of mass destruction, Africa, in our view, provides enough ungoverned space, maritime, land, legal, financial, etc., to be of significant concern. So, from our perspective, continued progress in Africa, developing African security capacities and governance capacities is really vital to our security. So, I thank you very much for your kind attention. And again, thank you to the Institute for giving me this opportunity. And I would welcome your questions and or comments. Thanks.
Um período de perguntas e respostas, aproximadamente de 20 minutos.
I have a question if there is some reluctance to. Your concept of ungoverned space. There are 2 problems in those spaces that 2 American allies are deeply involved with. One is that there's the process of radicalization of Muslim populations, both in Western Africa and in Eastern Africa. And part of this radicalization is associated with Saudi Arabia activities, mainly building a lot of madrasas. So the process is quite similar to what happened in Afghanistan and in Pakistan throughout the 80s. And we know what was the result of that process in Afghanistan. But another American ally, Pakistan, is also deeply involved in the proliferation of weapons, but also of material to build weapons, both buying in Africa and also selling weapons to African movements and groups. So what is Washington doing regarding that? Is Washington talking and putting some pressure on Saudi Arabia and Pakistan regarding those activities?
I know that we have an ongoing dialogue. My colleagues that work in those areas have an ongoing dialogue with the Saudi government and Pakistan about those problems, and I think they are endeavoring to address them. Although it is pervasive, and it is not, I think, necessarily something that that the governments per se control directly. Much of it is done by, well, in the case of the madrasas and the education support, that is done by ostensibly charitable organizations that are also providing obviously legitimate aid. And you know, the challenge that we face is that if we don't have an alternative to offer, if it is a choice between having a madrasa to go to school or having nothing, it's a pretty difficult choice. So the challenge is that while we have to obviously put some pressure on these governments to make their aid non-ideological in nature, because we don't want the Saudis, for example, to stop providing aid to these countries necessarily. That's not the objective. We want that aid, obviously, to not be for ideological or proselytizing purposes, but to simply provide aid and support. But while we pressure them on that, we obviously, on the other side, also have to be providing alternatives ourselves. And I know USAID is working in that area now with more education initiatives to provide alternatives. The Pakistani problem obviously is a long-standing one, and I know my colleagues, that is a topic of conversation with them, but that's something that my Middle Eastern colleagues would be probably more familiar with the status of that dialogue than I am.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. With all of these challenges that you face in Africa, what do you expect from European countries, and especially from a country like Portugal?
I think what we expect and what we offer as well actually is cooperation and consultation to address these problems together. I don't think there are so many challenges that you oftentimes it's difficult to figure out where to begin. Although I think there's an African saying that if you have to eat an elephant, the best way to do it is one bite at a time. So, better if you have to eat an elephant if you can get lots of people to help you eat that elephant. And if we are all taking one bite at a time, maybe we'll finish that elephant much faster without getting too much indigestion. So I think our objective is to work in concert with our European allies in Africa. We have started doing that in many places, in West Africa and ECOWAS, in the AU, and in Congo. I think we have some very interesting cooperative initiatives underway, and we want to increase those. We used to all sort of approach our security cooperation with Africa in our own little stovepipe. We did whatever we wanted to do, and the UK did what they wanted to do, and France and Portugal, etc. But that is not going to help us make progress in the context of capacity building. We need to work together, and so that is really all that we expect from the Europeans is to engage with us in an exchange of information. We want to be open. We are willing to tell everybody everything that we're doing. And we hope that that same openness will be shared with us by our European colleagues. So far, I think it has. So we figure that's the best way to go forward.
Nuno Matias, retired admiral. From my sensibility to Africa, I appreciated very much your presentation. And I have two questions. The first of all comes from the interest I have on your initiative in helping African countries to control their maritime coastal areas. Then the question is, we know that in Africa there are lots of maritime piracy, including also armed robbery. We know that there is the possibility of a connection between terrorism and piracy. Do you have any information about Africa that this is something that exists already? That's the first question. The second is different, is about Angola and the ungoverned areas. We know that Angola has a huge territory, has diamonds, has lots of uncontrolled weapons. Then it makes ungoverned areas, uncontrolled weapons, and diamonds is an explosive mixture for terrorism. Is this already a threat? Because if it is, I think that Portugal can give a hand, as well as other Portuguese-speaking countries from the community of Portuguese-speaking countries. We can lobby in favor of a better space control, and I think with also the United States support, to have better communication facilities, roads, railways, in order to occupy the territory and to improve quality of life. I'm sorry for being so long.
No, thank you very much for the question. On the nexus between piracy and terrorism, I think that there is certainly a potential there. Obviously, currently the most significant problem with piracy is off the Somali coast, and that has created havoc in the international shipping lanes. It's not just, yes, it's true, yeah, Nigeria as well. Although I think a different scale in some contexts. The Somali pirates are bolder, although I would expect that the pirates operating in the Niger Delta area will get bold soon enough. The disruption, in particular, off of the Somali coast to international shipping lanes has been quite significant, and this. We have great concerns about that. I mean, piracy is, it is against international law, obviously, and we think that we can't allow this to persist, because essentially it is ceding. I talk about African nations ceding space to competing, governance. We ourselves, if we allow piracy to go on without addressing it, go on with impunity, and simply allow the insurance companies to pay off the pirates, we too are ceding space, and so we should not be guilty of the same thing that African governments are often forced to do because they have no choice. So is there right now a direct connection? We do not have specific information to indicate that this is specifically being used right now as a revenue generator for terrorist operations. However, our concern is that if it continues to go unchecked, that it very well may, in the not too distant future, become or be used as a revenue source. We do not want those who have the motivation to conduct terrorist attacks to get the idea that a good way to raise money for their efforts is to pirate a ship and hold it for ransom and get $1 million or more in insurance money. So we don't want that. We don't want to wait until we get that, that specific. If we wait until we have the specific information that a pirated ship, the resources gained from that was used to launch a terrorist attack, we've waited too long. Which is why we are trying to be proactive in this regard. For the present. Off the Somali coast, where the impact has been, again, greatest on international shipping and freedom of navigation. We are looking to the international community and our partners, particularly those who are as dependent on freedom of navigation as we are, to be helpful in that effort. I think we have a collective responsibility in the international community to work against piracy. And that's not an easy task because it is primarily a law enforcement endeavor. So it requires different kinds of operations. Then it is not just a traditional naval operation, and obviously we are well past the days of the Barbary Coast pirates, where the solution for a captured pirate was to hang him by the yardarm. So we actually have to collect evidence, so we have to be able to prosecute them, try them, throw them in jail, etc. And so that requires a lot of international cooperation. So this is something that we hope that we will be able to get support. We're asking, what support are we looking for from the European colleagues? This is one area where we think we do need to get support in order to prevent this from becoming a source of funding for terrorists in the future. As to the Angola issue and ungoverned space and diamonds, I think, again, the illicit diamond trade is, it's a great subject for a great spy novel, I think, because it is so murky, and we know so little definitively about how that works, because it's so easy to move diamonds untracked. I think obviously the conflict diamonds issue has been, prominent on the international arena for some time. There has also been speculation, none of it proved definitively, although also equally none of it unproved or disproved, that illicit diamonds have facilitated or gone into terrorist financing. So I think that it is incumbent upon us to try and use the various mechanisms that have been established to deal with the illicit diamond trade, to control it, stop it. And that includes, though, of course, physical control, control of the physical space where the diamonds are mined, so that you do not have illicit mining going on, and all of the diamonds are captured and run through the normal trading processes where they can be tracked and their sale can be tracked. So yes, I think, again, this is one of the problems that needs to be addressed. And I don't think it's something that we wait until we have the definitive evidence that that illicit diamond mining, whether it was in Sierra Leone or whether it was in Angola or wherever, financed a major terrorist attack. That's not the time to start trying to establish security. It's now before we have that unfortunate information. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for your communication. I would like to ask you one thing about mass destruction weapons. Besides South Africa, which countries or areas possess those materials? And if they did, where they did come from?
To clarify, of course, South Africa no longer possesses WMD. They eliminated their nuclear weapons program and their other programs back in the 1990s, and they are in complete compliance with all of the various conventions and actually are extremely good citizens and an excellent example, to be frank, for the control of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So they do not possess them and don't have any desire to. I think that's obvious. The concern only in South Africa is that the knowledge base that allowed South Africa to develop those weapons of mass destruction in the 1990s still exists. They still have very good education institutions that teach engineering and the various sciences. They still have a very active technology industry where engineering and components that can go into such weapons are developed for perfectly legitimate reasons, just like we all do. The challenge I think that the South Africans face is being able to exercise control over these legitimate activities. And that's certainly, it's a challenge for us all. I mean, how many times have our countries in the US or in Europe just barely caught undertaking, and they can only drill so many wells in a year, but these are some efforts that we are undertaking within the US military that we hope will have some health benefits for the civilian population. I think I hit the questions.
Sei que ainda havia algumas perguntas para fazer e peço desculpa às pessoas que não vão ter a oportunidade para fazer essas perguntas, mas temos que acabar agora. Chegamos ao fim do nosso tempo, infelizmente. Mas convém sublinhar que ouvimos hoje aqui muita coisa de um responsável político norte-americano que é importante e que abre algumas perspectivas interessantes para um país como Portugal, que tem muitos interesses em África. E é óbvio que esta redefinição da política africana dos Estados Unidos tem que ser bem acompanhada e com muita atenção no nosso país, e a intervenção de hoje foi um passo nesse sentido, certamente. Resta-me agradecer mais uma vez a presença de todos e também à Embaixada Norte-Americana pelo apoio que nos deu. E thank you very much again for your presence and for such an interesting and illuminating talk. Thank you very much.